All right, everybody, I'm ready to get started here. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. This is the beginning of the 7th week together, so we're pretty much right at that halfway point. The spring semester is kind of a weird one because of the spring break. So we're going to have that break coming up as well 2 weeks from today. So lecture this week, lecture next week, then spring break for a week, come back, and then we'll finish off the second part of the course, and then we'll take the second exam. I will make sure, though, that you are able to have some opportunities during the break to at least knock out some mini papers. So today we'll finish off chapter 5. We'll cover chapter 6, which is not very long, not very in depth at all. And then on Thursday we'll finish off chapter 7, which is also kind of not very complicated, just enough that it can be covered in one session. But I'll make the mini papers for chapter 6 and 7 due at the end of the spring break. So you'll have extra time to write those. You'll also have time to write the chapter 8 one. We'll cover a lot of chapter 8 before the break. So a lot of opportunities if you want to take them during the break, which you should, because you are in school, even though it is a break. It's not the idealized party that we see on MTV. It's time that you have available to you, that you don't have to go to class, that you don't have to do assignments, and so you should take advantage of that and make the most of it in terms of getting ahead, in terms of catching up, in terms of improving your overall performance and what you're doing thus far. Enjoy your time. Of course, there will be plenty of time during that period to, have some good times with your friends or whatnot. But beyond that, you just come to terms with the fact that you are still in school, and that is a big opportunity. And if things are a little bit overwhelming for you right now, or just a little bit off balance, it's a perfect opportunity to kind of set the ship in the right direction, get everything at least stabilized, so that you have a clear, manageable path forward to the end, which will be the march beyond the spring break. It will be the march to the end. So make sure that happens. And make sure you do it for yourselves. And things should, if you needed to turn around, should turn around. And if you don't need to turn around, we'll continue, at the level that they've continued at. And things will work out for you. All the work you're putting into the class will pay off. So let's make sure that happens. Well, you make sure that happens, and I'll just sit back and watch as it unfolds. Are there any questions about anything you'd like me to address in particular before I move forward with the material? Yeah. Well, we haven't finished it, chapter 5, so we'll finish it today, so it'll be due in a week. Yeah. Other questions? All right, then let us move forward. So we're going to cover chapter 6, the organization of the firm, today. It just deals with issues that were mentioned in the last chapter that reflect the role of the manager in the production process. One is having their workers work on the production process, on the production function that we've been talking about. And so we'll talk about a couple issues with respect to that. And then there's also the issues of managers selecting the right input mixes in order to minimize costs. Well, we'll talk about some practical issues associated with managers procuring their inputs in open markets. Like, what are the different methods of procuring inputs in open markets? Like, what are some of the obstacles that might pop up, that might require one approach versus another? So we'll just briefly discuss those. There'll be a lot of terminology in there, and there's one sort of abstract model that kind of helps us to establish the optimal length of setting up a contract with an input supplier if that's necessary. But that's as abstract as the chapter gets. Beyond that, it's very practical and just kind of learning some terminology that reflects knowledge that you likely already know intuitively. So shouldn't be too big of a hassle. But we are going to jump into that last portion of chapter 5 first, which has to do with multiple output cost functions. We've been talking about production, the nature of production overall, and how that informs cost. So we got from production to cost. And so this is just like a special case where like a firm is producing different types of goods, and so the question is like, how do you represent that in the cost function, and what does that say about the nature of the production process? Well, there's a couple of benefits that you can get by producing things together. You can have what are called economies of scope, which allow you to lower the costs of producing things together as opposed to apart. And we'll talk about the rest of that in a second. And then that's it. And then finally, chapter 7, which we'll cover on Thursday, will deal with the nature of industry and just sort of like the characteristics that make one industry more competitive than another industry. What are the things that we observe that kind of inform the structure of the industry? How do firms perform in these industries, given varying degrees of competition, and ultimately how do they behave as well in terms of like their pricing, and so some of the issues that will kind of frame the analysis for probably like, I don't know, the majority of the course going forward will just be touched upon in that chapter, kind of elucidating why we need to examine managerial decision making in different market settings, given their varying characteristics that again ultimately lead to a range of competition within different industries. All right, so last time, just to go over some of the stuff we went over, we talked about long run costs, and how they are related to the ability of the firm to establish how much they need of all inputs versus the short run, defined by the fact that one input is fixed. And in the short run, the optimal way for a firm to choose the amount of the input they're going to use is to set the value of the marginal product equal to the cost of the input. But in the long run, because they can adjust all the factors of production, and of course in the simple case we consider it's only 2 factors of production, then the cost minimizing input rule is for the firm to choose their inputs such that the marginal product per dollar spent is equivalent across all inputs, and we were able to establish that insight via the framework that we looked at that was very similar to the rational consumer choice model framework, that had these iso-quant curves that represent the same amount of output that can be produced with varying amounts of the 2 inputs, in this case capital and labor, and the interaction of those with the iso cost curves that represent the same costs that might be taken on to produce using varying amounts of the 2 inputs. And so the point at which those 2 intersect is the optimal point. It's a cost minimizing input mix for a particular production output target. In this case, it was a target of 100. And so if the firm used a lot of capital, a little bit of labor, then they could, of course, produce that 100 units, but they could produce it at a lower cost, which is represented by this ISO cost line, which is closer to the origin. And so this optimal, this input mix of this amount of capital and this amount of labor is the amount that will minimize the cost of producing 100 units for the firm. And again, that's the point at which the slopes of the 2 curves are tangent, and the slope of the iso-quant line is known as a marginal rate of technical substitution, the rate at which a firm can substitute one input for the other and maintain the level of output. And the slope of the ISO cost line is the relative price, the price of the input on the x-axis, the price of the input on the y-axis, which is the wage rate over the rental rate. So at that point of tangency, the slopes are equal. The slope of the marginal rate of technical substitution is also equal to the ratio of the marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital. And so if you move them around, you get to that condition where, again, at the cost minimizing the cost minimizing mix of inputs, the extra amount of output per dollar spent on each input is going to be equivalent across all inputs. Then we talked about the cost function. Now there's fixed cost, variable cost, short cost. Fixed cost, variable cost, which equal total cost, which equal the short run total cost function, which again reflect the fact that in the short run there's at least one input into production fixed. There's a marginal cost, an extra cost of producing additional units that needs to be considered as well. And then what's most important is looking at average cost. So average fixed cost is fixed cost divided by quantity, average variable cost is variable cost divided by quantity, and then average total cost is total cost divided by quantity. And average total cost is also the sum of average fixed cost plus average variable cost. And this basically shows the relationship between the marginal cost and the average cost, which is most important. So again, marginal cost is the extra cost of producing additional units. First, it is decreasing because of increasing returns assumed to be like the common characteristic of just like the most general production process. Initially, there's increasing returns, and then there's decreasing returns as the firm, is limited by the amount of capital they've chosen, and so each additional worker produces less than the prior one, but the amount they produce is positive. But the marginal cost of producing additional units increases as a result of that. Here we have our average variable cost curve, which initially is decreasing because the marginal cost is below it. But as soon as they're equivalent, that starts to then cross that line where the marginal cost is above the average variable cost and starts to pull up average variable cost. So the bottom of the average variable cost curve occurs at the point where it's equal to marginal cost, and that's going to be important for the supply decision that we'll talk about later in Chapter 8. The total cost curve has a U shape as well, being pulled down by marginal cost and then ultimately being pulled up by marginal cost once marginal cost crosses it, just like average variable cost, but it happens after the average variable cost minimum because average total cost is also has a component of that average fixed cost. Average fixed cost, if in the short run, as long as the firm is not adjusting its capital, average fixed cost will always be decreasing because you have a certain amount that's spent on the capital, and that is always going to be divided by a larger and larger number as the firm increases their scale of production. And so then you have that spreading effect of the average fixed cost, which is pulling down the average total cost curve. Over this range up until the bottom of the average variable cost curve, it's both the average fixed cost and average variable cost bringing it up. But as average variable costs start to be pulled up due to that diminishing returns effect, then that starts to have that countervailing force on the total average total cost curve. But over this range here, the average fixed cost spreading effect is still dominant, still pulling down average total cost. But at the point where marginal cost crosses it is the point where the diminishing returns that's causing average variable cost to increase becomes a dominant force on average total cost and starts to pull up the average total cost. So you're always going to get that U-shaped average total cost curve. We looked at the algebra for cost functions, and they're usually going to be cubic. Cubic cost functions will reflect the characteristics we just looked at on the graphs. And the marginal cost of an average of a total cost function is, of course, the derivative of the total cost function, which we looked at. We looked at also the long run average cost curve, which is defines the minimum average cost of producing alternative levels of output, allowing for optimal selection of all variables of production. So the firm's on this average total cost curve, and if they want to expand production, then their average total cost will start going up because of that diminishing returns effect. So when they're in the long run, they're going to buy more capital, and it's going to get them on a new average total cost curve that's, again, reflective of like a new short run situation with more capital. So that would lower the amount of like the cost of producing Q1. But if things are going well, the firm's going to want to expand output. and that means they have to move along that average total cost curve again, eventually realizing they need more capital. In the long run, they're able to get it. They jump on this new average total cost curve and minimize the cost of producing Q2. But we see that there is a long run path for those average total costs, which is the long run average cost curve, which is the red curve. And again, it defines the minimum average cost of producing alternative levels of output. So over the range where long run average costs are decreasing, we say that there are economies of scale. Firms are benefit by being larger because the average cost of producing goes down. And then that hits a minimum, and eventually they can get into a diseconomies of scale range in which they have decreasing returns to scale. This is also known as increasing returns to scale. This is known as decreasing returns to scale, in which they get bigger and bigger and bigger over the long run, but the size starts to become an impediment to their efficiency, which starts to drive up long run average costs. You can have industries where there are constant returns to scale. In those industries, it doesn't matter if firms are large or small, but in industries where there are economies of scale, it makes sense for there to be larger firms, and there will be larger firms, and therefore, when the nature of the production process that firms operate in exhibits economies of scale, you're going to have more of an oligopoly type situation, less competition, more large firms dominating the market. In industries where it's really easy to get into that diseconomies of scale range, then you're going to have a lot more competition because firms don't want to get too big because they are going to run up against that long run average cost increase. So the nature of the long run average cost says a lot about the nature of how of the industry that a firm might operate in, how competitive it might be. Was there a question? Sure. I did not. I went back.
How could a firm go from Q naught to Q1? It's on the same average total cost curve, but for example, would a firm get from one point to the other?
From Q naught to Q1?
Yeah.
Along their average total cost curve? Oh, they just increase the amount of output.
Right. So then when you increase the amount of output and your average total cost goes up, that's when they go to the long run and buy more capital, maybe?
Yeah, that's when they realize we need to buy more capital. And so when they're able to do that, they do, right? And then they wind up on a new average total cost curve that's reflective of that new amount of capital. Yeah. So they spend a lot more in fixed costs, which means the spreading effect is a lot larger for them, which means that their average total cost is decreasing for a longer range at a bigger scale. It usually involves spending a lot more on capital. All right, so that's costs. Well, let's talk about this multi-output cost function. So analysis for the case of a firm that produces a single output also applies to a multi-product firm, but additional issues have to be addressed. Assume the cost function for a multi-product firm is given by this just general relationship where Q1 is a number of units produced of product 1 and Q2 is a number of units produced of product 2. It could be like a car manufacturer that produces both economy class cars and trucks, let's say. The multi-product cost function defines the cost of producing Q1 units of output of product 1 and Q2 units of output of product 2, assuming all inputs are used efficiently. So we assume that they are cost minimizing. They're always at those tangency points between their ISO cost and ISO quant lines, curves. The cost of production depend on how much of each type of output is produced. This gives rise to what economists call economies of scope and cost complementarities. Economies of scope exist whenever total cost of producing the two different outputs together is less than the total cost of producing them separately. So when the cost of producing each one separately is greater than the cost of producing them together. So that's economies of scope. In a restaurant, to produce given quantities of steak and chicken dinners, it generally is cheaper to produce both products in the same restaurant, right? Rather than have a separate set of facilities for cooking just chicken dinners versus just steak dinners. So that's a very simple case that just highlights the nature of economies of scope. Cost complementarities exist in a multi-product cost function when the marginal cost of producing one output is reduced when the output of another product is increased. So the extra cost of producing additional units goes down when the output of the related product is increased. If we let, again, C of Q1, Q2 be the cost function for a multi-product firm, and we let MC1 of Q1, Q2 be the marginal cost of producing the first output, so it would be the partial derivative of the cost function with respect to the quantity of the first type of output. The cost function exhibits cost complementarity if, again, the marginal cost of producing additional units given increase in the output of the second unit. So the marginal cost of producing, let's say, cars goes down when additional trucks are produced. Then that would mean that we have cost complementarities. An example, just the simplest one, is the production of donuts and donut holes. So the marginal cost of producing donut holes goes down when the firm produces additional donuts, right? Because you just take the donut stuff out of the middle of it and just make a ball out of it, and there you go. So the concepts of economies of scope and cost complementarity can also be examined within the context of an algebraic functional form for a multi-product cost function. Suppose the multi-product cost function is quadratic. So it takes this form here, where there's some fixed costs plus there's some term that represents the joint cost of producing both outputs, plus this term that represents the cost of producing output 1, and then plus this term that represents the cost of producing output 2. So these are the variable costs, and this is the variable cost due to producing them together. These are the variable costs of producing them independently. For the cost function, the marginal cost of producing output 1 is the derivative of this function with respect to Q1. So the derivative of this with respect to the fixed cost is 0 because fixed costs are constants, they don't change. The derivative of this with respect to Q1, well, there's Q2 in there, but when you're taking a partial derivative, you assume the other variable is just a constant as well. So we leave that alone as we leave A, which is just a number as well. So the derivative of this with respect to Q1 is equal to AQ2. And then the only other term that has Q1 in it is this term here. This one is considered a constant because it doesn't have Q2 in it, so that drops out as well. The derivative of this with respect to Q1 is 0. The derivative of this with respect to Q1 is 2Q1. So there you go. So this represents the marginal cost of producing additional units of output 1. And we can see that it is dependent on producing output 2. So when that coefficient on that interaction term that represents the joint cost of producing both, the variable cost of producing both of these outputs together, when that constant A is negative, an increase in Q2 reduces the marginal cost of producing Q1, meaning that when that coefficient is negative, if you increase the output of the second good, so let's say it's the donut holes, if you're increasing the amount of donut holes you're producing, the additional cost of producing donuts is going to go down. So you're going to have cost complementarities as a result, and that's how you're able to represent it in the cost function with the coefficient on that interaction term being negative. All right, so the multi-product cost function, again, this is the equation for it, and it has corresponding marginal costs, the one we derived up here, and then a similar expression for 2, just switching the subscripts there. Don't worry, I won't expect you to be able to derive this, but you should be able to identify if a multi-product cost function has cost complementarities. So just make sure you understand what property it needs to have in order to demonstrate that. To examine whether economies of scope exist for a quadratic multi-product cost function, recall that there are economies of scope if the production of the two goods together is going to be greater than the production of the two goods together. So if we rearrange this, we could rearrange this expression here. So essentially, we would just subtract this term from both sides. We could wind up with this expression here. And the condition may be rewritten as, by plugging in our terms, we've got the cost of producing output 1, which would be some fixed cost plus some variable cost, and then the cost of producing output 2, which is again some fixed cost plus the variable cost of producing that second output, minus the multi-product cost function, which is the function we were just looking at a second ago. So from this, the F's are going to cancel out. Q1's squared will cancel out. Q2 squared will cancel out as well. And we'll be left with just this term here. F minus the interactive term there of the two of the variable cost of producing the two outputs together. If we get this to the right-hand side by adding this term to both sides, then essentially what this is telling us is that if the fixed cost is greater than this term here, again, the term representing the variable cost of producing them together, then there will be economies of scope in this production process. So economies of scope are realized in producing output levels Q1 and Q2 if the fixed cost is greater than that term, again, the variable cost of producing them together. So summary of the properties of the quadratic multi-product cost function. The multi-product cost function that you guys love exhibits cost complementarity whenever that coefficient on that interactive term is negative. So if it's negative, then we know that the cost function exhibits cost complementarity. Again, that means that the marginal cost of producing additional units go down as you produce more of the other output. And it has economies of scope as long as the fixed cost term is greater than that joint interactive variable cost term. So just make sure you know this, and what it means. Like, what does that mean to have cost complementarity and economies of scope, and how do you identify that from a cost function? Yeah.
Yeah. So for number 2, we don't really have to do any derivatives. We just get the cost function at the bottom, and then just compare the F and the A Q1.
Correct. All right, quick demonstration problem just to highlight like the importance and the practical application of this stuff. So suppose a cost function for firm A produces 2 goods and is given by this cost function here. The firm wishes to produce 5 units of good 1 and 4 units of good 2. The question is, do cost complementarities exist and do economies of scope exist? All right, so let's look at, there's a second part. Firm A is considering selling the subsidiary that produces good 2 to firm B, in which case it will only produce good 1. What will happen to firm A's cost if it continues to produce 5 units of good 1? So then we have to kind of examine the situation. We have to examine, do cost complementarities exist? Do economies of scope exist? If so, what's going to happen if this firm sells off one portion of its production process? Like, if it just decides to produce Q1, like if it has economies of scope, then its cost should go up. But if it doesn't, its cost would go down. All right, so for the cost function, we know that A, the coefficient on that interactive term, is negative, and therefore there are indeed cost complementarities. Economies of scope exist since if we look at, again, this term relative to this term, we plug in the Q1 and Q2 units. Q1, again, in this case, is 4 and 2 for good 2, so that we have 8 times 0.5, which is 4, which, of course, is less than 100. So economies of scope exist in producing 5 units of good 1 and 4 units. Oh, it's 5 units of good 1 and 4 units of good 2. So that's 5 times 4, that's 20, times 1/2 is 10. That's still going to be less than 100. So there are indeed economies of scope in this production process. To determine what will happen to firm A's cost if it sells a subsidiary that produces good 2 to firm B, we have to calculate the cost under the alternative scenarios. So notice that the total cost to firm A of producing 5 units of good 1 fall from, so again, we look at the cost of producing 5 units of good 1, which is 131, and the firm, if it were to just simply produce 5 units of of that good, then it would incur a cost of $125. But the cost to firm B of producing 4 units of good 2, in this case, will be $116, which with $125, obviously significantly more than $131. So firm A's cost will fall by only $6 when it stops producing good 2, and the cost of firm B of producing 4 units of good 2 will be $116. The combined cost of the two firms of producing the output originally produced by a single firm will be $110 more than the cost of producing by a single firm. So the preceding problem illustrates some important aspects of mergers and sales of subsidiaries. First, when there are economies of scope, two firms producing distinct outputs should merge into a single firm and enjoy reduction in cost. So they would exist along that economies of scale, that increasing returns to scale range of their long run average total cost with respect to like them producing those goods together. Second, selling off an unprofitable subsidiary could lead to only a minor reduction in cost. So if you're exhibiting economies of scope and you are losing money on one of your subsidiaries, your cost may not go down that much if you sell that subsidiary off. And in fact, when economies of scope exist, it's difficult to allocate costs across product lines. All right, so that's those are some important issues. I was just reading an article about like how the digital era has like changed the nature of like the film industry. The film industry now is like producing a lot of like the different types of final output, via the same production process. So they get to enjoy those economies of scope due to the digital innovations that have dramatically reduced the cost of producing additional units, which have increased revenues for them. Because like before, like they had to produce like one output in one way versus a different output in a different way, like videotapes versus film prints that are sent to theaters, versus now everything's digital. So it's like everything can be finalized like in the same department, and like the output can be used essentially for a variety of distribution channels, and they've managed to reduce costs quite a bit, and therefore expand the amount of output, which we've seen dramatically in like the amount of variation we see in the amount of filmed entertainment that's available now versus like 10, 15, 20 years ago. All right, anyway, let's talk about chapter 6. And again, the issues related to like a manager being able to perform on the production function and being able to procure inputs in order to minimize cost, because obviously everything that we've talked about is very abstract. It's just meant to give us general kind of insights into like the most general production processes, and then ultimately it's up to you to kind of use that as your basic intuition about how a production process should work, and then compare it against what you ultimately would see in practice, in order to be able to have some insights into how things could work versus how they are working, and maybe be able to adapt or change or whatever, innovate, who knows. All right, so again, to be able to cost minimize, the firm needs to set their output levels in the long run at the point where the marginal products per dollar spent are equivalent across all inputs. But also, like in practice, when they're trying to actually procure inputs, there are other issues that could arise that could affect their cost minimizing choices. So a manager can use several approaches to obtain the inputs needed to produce a final product. The first is to buy the inputs in spot markets, which are essentially just open markets. You'd pay the market price for the good or service, one-time transaction, done. Like you know exactly where to buy the good. Generally, there's going to be a lot of suppliers of that same input. Maybe it's like certain type of bolt that you need for whatever it is. Maybe you're a crane, a construction crane supplier, and like there's certain bolts you need, but they're very prevalent, so you can get them from a bunch of suppliers. So you do when you need them, and you're done. Another option is to sign a contract with a firm that provides the good or service and pay the price negotiated in a contract. So if the item is not standardized and there isn't a lot of competition for the good that you need, that input that you need, then it might serve the manager best, as far as the cost minimizing approach, to just set up a contract with a supplier and just let that be exclusive. But the complexity of the contract might be an issue, which we'll talk about. Or the third option is just simply to vertically integrate, right? So as far as like the vertical ladder of production, firms have any final good or service is part of a vertical production process where you have certain inputs that are being created in other sort of rungs of this vertical ladder, and then they are being used as inputs into production. So they're essentially intermediate goods that are being produced to produce final goods and services. Um, and if it's not easy to buy the input in the open market and it's not easy to set up a contract, then a firm should ultimately decide to vertically integrate, to assimilate that production process into their own production process. Each option will imply different cost functions for the manager. The manager's job is to choose a method that minimizes costs. So let's talk about each one in turn. Purchase the inputs using a spot exchange. Again, this involves this occurs. So a spot exchange occurs when the buyer and seller of an input meet, exchange, and then go their separate ways. The parties may make an exchange without even knowing each other's names, and there's no formal legal relationship between buyer and seller. A key advantage is that the firm gets to specialize in what it does best, converting inputs into output. It doesn't have to be distracted, or its focus doesn't have to be split on producing that final output as well as producing like that intermediate input that they need. They can just focus on what they set out to do, and it's the least complicated way. A spot exchange is often used when inputs are standardized, as I mentioned, when it's really easy to get the input. A lot of folks are making it. There's a lot of competition in the market for it, so nobody has any leverage over you, and therefore the transactions are simple, never a problem. The next option is to acquire the inputs under a contract. A contract, of course, as you know, is a legal document that creates an extended relationship between a particular buyer and a seller of an input. It specifies the terms under which they agree to exchange over a given time horizon. And that's where it gets tricky, the time horizon issue. As the time horizon gets longer, more contingencies need to be considered, which means more complexity to the contracts, which means paying lawyers more money. It can get very expensive. And ultimately, the point is to try to get a complete contract that covers all contingencies, but that is nearly impossible as the time period gets longer and the costs start to increase. So it can be difficult and costly to write a complete contract. Acquiring inputs with contracts does, though, allow a firm to specialize in what it does best. So even if the spot markets don't work out, for issues we'll talk about in a second, and the contracting environment is too complex, then it makes sense to vertically integrate. But if not, then the firm should avoid that at all costs in order to just focus on what it's set out to do, in terms of producing that final good and service that it's best at. Contracts also allow a firm to purchase non-standard inputs for which there may not be many suppliers. So again, like if the market for the input is not standardized and it's easy for a firm to use their leverage over you in some way to try to raise your costs, which we'll talk about a couple of issues related to that in a second, then those situations would likely be served better with contracts. And then, of course, the final option is to produce inputs internally. When a firm shuns other suppliers and chooses to produce an input internally, it's engaged in vertical integration. With this option, a firm loses the gains in specialization, though. That's the big drawback. They no longer are able to just focus on what they are truly good at, what they truly want to be good at, and now they have to deal with like a whole other department with whole other issues, costs. Maybe they have other inputs, like there's employment issues related to those departments, etc. All right, now let's talk about the things that could affect the decision to either use one method of procuring inputs versus another, and of course that is costs. What kind of costs are there associated with the various methods? So those costs fall under the category of transaction costs, costs in excess of the actual amount paid to the input supplier when acquiring an input. Transaction costs can include the cost of searching for a supplier willing to sell a given input. So again, like if input is not standardized and it's hard to find the input that you need, the time has an opportunity cost. The cost of negotiating a price at which the input will be purchased. So again, like if it's not a standardized item that everybody sells and therefore everybody sells at the same price, then there is going to be some ability for the supplier to negotiate and again, ultimately enforce some leverage over you that could affect your costs. Other investments and expenditures required to facilitate exchange. So there might be additional costs that need to be incorporated into the transaction, which we'll talk about in a second. So those additional costs are called specialized investments. An investment in a particular exchange that cannot be recovered in another trading relationship. So let's say for those bolts that you as a crane manufacturer need, you need them to be very specific as far as like the weight, as far as like the integrity of the structure, because ultimately, like we're talking about a key element of something that obviously is going to be a huge part of construction, but ultimately has like a lot of safety implications, right? Like if the integrity of the structure is not sound, the crane, then that could result in people dying. So let's say the firm then had to invest in a certain type of technology to be able to test those bolts. And so let's say there's one manufacturer, they create the bolt, and you as a buyer need to buy this special machine to make sure that the bolts are exactly up to the specifications you need them to be, because if they are not, then it all goes to crap, right? So that represents a specialized investment. When a specialized investment is necessary, the manager engages in what's called the relationship-specific exchange. So the resulting relationship, which is the resulting relationship between the parties when specialized investments are required to facilitate an exchange. A relationship-specific exchange, again, due to the fact that there's a specialized investment necessary in order to procure an input. Types of specialized investments, site specificity. This occurs when the buyer and seller of an input must locate their plants close to each other to be able to engage in an exchange. So this has everything to do with location. So in order to buy a certain input, it makes sense for the producer to have their factory close to the supplier of that input. Electric power plants are often located close to particular coal mines in order to minimize transportation costs of obtaining coal. It's a lot cheaper to transport electricity out of a location than to transport a bunch of coal into a location from a power plant, from a coal mining operation. The cost of building the two plants close to each other represents a specialized investment, resulting in a relationship-specific exchange that would have little value if the parties were not involved in exchange. So if the power plant relationship with the coal supplier sours, then like it just really makes no sense for the power plants to be in the locations that they're at, close to like coal mines. Another type of specialized investment is physical asset specificity, which refers to a situation where the capital equipment needed to produce an input is designed to meet the needs of a particular buyer and cannot be readily adapted to produce inputs needed by other buyers. So if the manufacturer of those bolts had to get like certain machinery just to produce those bolts and nobody else can use, then that represents physical asset specificity and is a specialized investment. Dedicated assets, so general investments made by a firm that allow it to exchange with a particular buyer. So let's say there's a producer of like a certain circuit for a computer, let's say. And so they get like Microsoft as their client, and so they know that the scale of their production is going to increase dramatically as a result of this new demand for their circuit. So they build a whole new factory for it. They build a whole new operation just to supply Microsoft. That's a dedicated asset. That's a specialized investment. That's a relationship-specific exchange. If that relationship goes sour, they no longer have that demand for their product. That dedicated asset becomes irrelevant. It becomes a sunk cost. Human capital as a specialized investment. So workers must usually learn specific skills to work for a particular firm that may not be transferable to other employers. So if that is the case, then that is also considered a specialized investment. Implications of specialized investments for transaction costs. Generally, specialized investments increase transaction costs in three ways. One is costly bargaining. So if specialized investments are required to obtain the input, then bargaining is required, which can be costly, right? So again, if you're gonna spend extra amount of money just to have a transaction, then there's gonna have to be negotiations in order to settle on the terms of that arrangement, which is going to take time, might require lawyers, and that all has an opportunity cost, explicit and implicit costs, and so it can definitely raise transaction costs. Underinvestment. So when specialized investments are required to facilitate exchange, the level of specialized investments often is lower than the optimal level. So when firms know that the input, that the specialized investment is ultimately potentially a sunk cost, then they might just wind up underinvesting in whatever it is they need. Maybe like that special factory, that dedicated asset, or the site specificity, the location that they've created just to allow for the minimization of the cost of procuring those inputs. If they know that, then they might just not spend enough on these specialized investments, which could wind up resulting in like bad output in some way, which could be a problem, and generally will result in the need for a different approach, which could lead to sunk costs from the specialized investment, and thus can be a problem. The biggest problem, though, is opportunism and the hold-up problem. So when a specialized investment must be made to acquire an input, the buyer or seller may attempt to capitalize on the sunk nature of the investment by engaging in opportunism. So suppose the buyer of an input that costs $100 must make a specific investment of, let's say, $10, the cost of verifying the quality of a particular supplier's input. Once the $10 has been paid, the supplier then can attempt to hold up the manager by asking for a price of $109, right? So the buyer of an input is initially told that it costs $100 for the input, but as soon as the $10 is spent, then the buyer is told, oh no, now the price is $109, which is higher than the other suppliers. But this supplier knows that this manager has already spent that money on whatever it is they need to verify the integrity of that input that they're going to buy. And so for them to go to another supplier, it's going to cost them then $110 because they're going to lose those $10. So the supplier could then say, well, it'll cost you less by paying $109, which ultimately, again, is a means of opportunism for the input supplier. It is a means of holding up the manager in order to get more out of them, and is a common problem. So it's called the hold-up problem. Once a firm makes a specialized investment, the other party may attempt to rob it of its investment by taking advantage of the investment's sunk nature. All right, so given these issues, what is the optimal path for a manager in terms of input procurement? So they have to consider the economic trade-off of either one option or another. The cost minimizing method of acquiring an input depends on the characteristics of the input. Whether a manager chooses a spot exchange or an alternative method depends on the importance of the specialized investments that lead to relationship-specific exchanges. When the desired input does not involve specialized investment, the firm can use the spot exchange to obtain the input without concern for opportunism and bargaining costs. So again, it's all about like how much is a specialized investment, but what are the implications for the firm in terms of costs? Is the holdup problem a possibility? If none of these issues exist, then obviously the spot exchange is the best option. But if they do exist, then maybe a complex contract might be the best option. When the contracting environment is simple and the cost of writing a contract is less than the transaction cost associated with a spot exchange, it's optimal to acquire the input through a contract. So let's look at the optimal contract length issue now. Like, how long should a contract be, and what implications does that have for whether or not the firm should move forward with it versus either just taking a step back and using the spot exchange, or taking a step forward and vertically integrating the production of that input into their own process. So although a contract often requires substantial upfront expenditures, it offers several advantages. A contract can specify prices of the input before the parties make specialized investments, avoiding the holdup problem. Guarantees, they can guarantee an acceptable price for both parties for an extended time horizon, reducing the incentive for underinvestment. So again, it just solidifies the terms of the exchange, the relationship-specific exchanges, in order to avoid any of the problems that we talked about that could have implications for transaction costs. If a contract will be used, the most important question to consider is how long the contract should last. The optimal contract length reflects a fundamental economic trade-off between the marginal cost and the marginal benefit of extending the length of a contract. So we assume the marginal cost of extending a contract length increases as contracts become longer due to increased hypothetical contingencies. So again, as the firm wants to extend the length of the contract, they need to consider more and more possible things that could occur, that could affect the market environment that they operate in. And everything needs to be written into the contract in very specific terms, and they need to be negotiated by both parties. So there's a lot of legal fees that go into doing that. Also, the longer the contract, the greater the likelihood that some other supplier can provide the input at a lower cost in the future. If there are profits being made in an industry, that's going to generally attract other suppliers. So if there are firms making a lot of money providing an input, they're eventually going to have competition, which will lower the cost of the input, which will increase the marginal cost of a longer contract, because again, they could be lowering their costs by switching suppliers if the inputs become cheaper, rather than maintain the paying the price that they are paying based on what the contract specifies. We assume the marginal benefit of extending a contract for another year is the avoided transaction cost of opportunism and bargaining, and we just assume that to be constant here. These benefits may vary with the length of the contract, but for simplicity, we assume the flat marginal benefit curve. And thus, over a certain range, the marginal benefits of extending the contract are bigger than the marginal cost, and thus it makes sense to extend the contract to that point. But as soon as the marginal cost extends above marginal benefit, then obviously that's going to be the stopping point, and that's going to represent the point at which it's going to be optimal to write the contract in terms of its length. So the optimal contract length will increase when the level of the specialized investment required to facilitate an exchange increases. So again, if all of a sudden it costs more to set up, a special factory for that, for the supplier, or just any of the various specialized investments we talked about, then that will increase the marginal benefit at any given contract length of extending the contract, which will lead to a new optimal longer contract length. In this case, L1. The optimal contract length also depends on factors that affect the marginal cost of writing longer contracts. So how standardized the input may become. Again, if it becomes more and more standardized, meaning more suppliers can provide it, then that's going to affect the marginal cost. How complex the contracting environment is. Again, how how difficult it is to write in as many contingencies as possible, given the nature of the relationship that's being specified. So a less complex contracting environment um, and a more standardized input will lower the marginal cost at any given contract length of increasing the contract length. Um, so therefore, the optimal contract that will shift the marginal cost curve to the right, which will increase the optimal length of the contract. If you have more complex contracting environment and a less standardized product, then the marginal cost will increase at any given contract length of increasing the contract length, which will lower the optimal contract length, in this case, to L3. So just make sure you understand how these forces affect the optimal contract length, and also how the changes in marginal benefit also affect the optimal contract length. When the product being purchased is extremely complex or the economic environment is plagued by uncertainty, complete contracts will be extremely costly or even impossible to write. So again, when that optimal contract length becomes too long, which would require like ridiculous amounts of like lawyering, essentially. I'm going to use lawyer as a verb. Lawyering, that's what they do. It can get very ugly. I used to work when I was in grad school. Getting my master's, I was working as a videographer for legal firms, and it's ugly, but it's kind of fun if you're interested in fighting people and being rude to people and whatnot. All right, so the next best option, if that is the case, is to vertically integrate. To again just absorb the production process of the input into your own firm. The firm must bear the cost of setting up production facilities for producing a product. The firm no longer specializes in doing what it does best. Because of these difficulties, vertical integration should be viewed as a last resort, undertaken only when spot exchange or contracts have failed. But obviously, there's a lot of issues to consider there with respect to transaction costs, specialized investment, the complexity of the contracting environment, how standardized the input is. There's a lot to consider there, but I think in general, like this, what we just covered kind of at least highlights the key aspects of these considerations. And so, it's definitely something to think about. And as far as like your mini papers go, it's like, it's stuff that you can use to kind of talk about, the various firms and the situations that they find themselves in. And there's generally going to be some link there that will allow you to write something meaningful and not too complicated. All right, the other issues that are considered in the chapter are the issues of, again, working on the production function. How do you get employees to work on production functions? Well, ultimately, it's about incentive programs. You have to align the incentives of the firm with management. But there's also an issue related to managers themselves, because firms are owned by stockholders, resource holders. And so the question is also, how is a manager incentivized to align their interests with the interests of the firm owners? Both of these problems fall within what we call the principal agent problem in economics. The principal being, the person or the entity that has a certain intention, and the agent being the one that kind of like executes that intention. So the principal agent problem can be framed in terms of like the shareholders manager relationship, and then also in terms of the manager employee relationship. So let's look at the principal agent problem with respect to the firm owners and the manager first. When ownership is separated from control, the principal agent problem emerges. If the owner is not present to monitor the manager, it's a challenge to get the manager to have the same goals as the owner. The important question from the owner's point of view is how much leisure the manager will consume while on the job. Meaning how much will they shirk, meaning avoid responsibility. Obviously, when you are put into a position of some control, you're going to have the ability to choose whether or not you yourself want to, dedicate all your time to the firm, or just enjoy some of that freedom that you have by doing things that are related to your job. So this is just like a hypothetical sort of table representing the manager's earnings. Let's say it's 50 grand, and obviously that's constant, and how that relates to the amount of hours they're going to work, and the profits of the firm, and how that might lead to hours of just not doing anything. So as we see, it's very clear. The manager's earnings are independent of the profits, and therefore for the manager who could work 8 hours and help the firm make a profit of $3 million, their earnings at that level of work are no different than their level of earnings at 0 hours of work with 8 hours of playing golf. That would lead to $0 for the firm in terms of profits. Obviously, a manager would not go that far, but obviously for them, there's no incentive to be at this level. Even just shirking 1 hour a day will lower profits not that much to the extent that the manager might be willing to get away with that. And so obviously the main way to sort of align a manager's intentions with the firm to solve the principal agent problem is to incentivize their wages with that of the profits of the firm. In this case, by making their wages contingent on how much profit the firm makes. In this case, 10% of the profits go to the manager. And so we see that the manager now has an incentive to to work 8 hours and make 300 grand versus work 0 hours and make $0. So it's very simple, intuitive insight. I'm sure in your other management classes, for those of you that are management majors, you get into this in a lot of detail, and there's all sorts of theory related to what are the best ways to get workers and the firm's interests in line, as well as managers and the interests of the firm's owners in line. So incentive contracts obviously will discipline managers. Typically, the chief executive officer of a corporation receives stock options and other bonuses directly related to profit. But there are external incentives as well that managers do need to consider. One that's probably the most important is their reputation, right? If they are known to be just shirkers, avoiding responsibility, then their value as a manager in the open market for managers becomes, quite a bit less. Their prospects of going elsewhere diminish. And so that is one incentive that does help to solve the principal agent problem just by its very nature, by the very nature of the position and its viability in labor markets. So in the long run, a manager's reputation can be sold at a premium in the market for managers. And managers, good managers, are highly valued. In fact, they're considered one of the main components to flourishing firms, to positive economic growth throughout the industry, and they're also considered to be in short supply. Even when the employment contract does not explicitly include a performance bonus, a manager may choose to do a good job of running the firm just based on the fact that their reputation might be marred if they don't. The threat of takeovers can also create an external incentive for managers. If a manager is not operating the firm at a profit-maximizing manner, then investors will attempt to buy the firm and replace management with new managers who will. So that's always a consideration. If the firm is not operating at its optimal level, then it does become vulnerable to takeovers. And obviously that's something the managers need to take into consideration as well. And then finally, of course, the manager-worker principal-agent problem. Solutions to the manager-worker principal-agent problem. One is profit sharing. So again, same as with the manager, setting up a profit-sharing scheme with workers, making the workers' compensation dependent on the underlying profitability of the firm, will enhance the workers' efforts. Revenue sharing. So that was profit sharing. So this is revenue sharing. Revenue sharing links compensation to the underlying revenues of the firm. Examples of this type of incentive scheme include tips and sales commissions. Revenue sharing is most effective when worker productivity is related to revenues rather than costs. So if you have a retail security guard, their job is related to costs, right? if they are enforcing, the integrity of like their security of the operations that they secure, then obviously they are doing their job better than not. And if they're doing a bad job, then that hurts the firm because they lose, whatever people steal or whatever. So that job is more related to costs than revenues. So a retail security guard will likely find revenue sharing to be ineffective, since his productivity is more strongly related to the store's cost. So there isn't like a just a catch-all sort of approach here. It will depend on the nature of the business that you might be managing and the relationship of the employees to either revenues or profits. One problem with revenue-based incentive schemes is that they do not provide an incentive for workers to minimize costs. So, if you're looking at like restaurant employees, then they might wind up just giving customers like a lot of extra food or whatever, just to kind of get bigger tips. So that could be a problem for the firm, obviously, because they wind up incurring larger costs. Piece rates. So another option to solve the principal agent problem is just to base the income of workers on like the amount of output they produce. Generally, in that situation, the workers aren't employees; they're more considered independent contractors. So paying workers based on a per unit produced compensation scheme rather than a fixed hourly wage is a piece rate. A potential problem with this approach is that effort must be expended in quality control, right? If there's an incentive to produce more, then the employees might wind up just like producing a bunch of crap, but at a really fast rate, which would increase the amount of their income. So lower quality will reduce sales, thus reducing compensation to those receiving revenue or profit sharing incentives. Time clocks and spot checks. So that's the last way that's suggested here to solve the principal agent problem, is to have sort of like random checks by managers of the employees that they cannot predict. So time clocks on their own are generally not useful in addressing the principal agent problem, since they do not monitor effort. They're merely a way of making sure that employees are coming in and leaving. The advantage of spot checks is that they reduce the cost of monitoring workers by having just random spot checks. Again, like the fear of being caught by a manager of shirking is enough to have workers, not working. I don't like these issues. I don't like talking about these issues a lot, because it's like very calculated with respect to people. And I know ultimately it has a lot to do with like how well people are being respected in the workplace. As long as employees are being respected and they're being paid like a fair wage, and they're going to work, But obviously, at like larger firms and larger scale operations, like the approaches tend to be a lot less personal, and so some of these issues do become a lot more relevant. Well, I mean, not necessarily, but like it depends on like in a command economy, if they have some sort of currency that they're using to pay their workers, but the workers may be paid in terms of food and not currency in those cases, and that might depend on the amount of effort they put in. So it could. Anyway, a disadvantage of spot checks is that they must occur frequently enough to induce workers not to risk getting caught shirking, and they must entail some penalty for workers getting caught shirking. Anyway, that is the end of this chapter, folks. Not very complicated, not a lot there. Hopefully it didn't beat your brains up the way some of the other stuff might have beat your brains up prior to this and forthcoming. We have the next chapter as well. That's not going to be too complicated as well. So you have another nice kind of lull there before we jump back into theory and math and whatnot. Anyway, beyond that, have a good couple of days, and I'll open up the homework for this. I will make the homeworks due next week, but I'll make the mini papers due at the end of the spring break. All right, I'll see you guys.